Hello and welcome back to Shakesyear. We are finishing up Arden of Faversham today. We get to hear from Franklin, who's going to give us what some versions call the epilogue and other versions call Act 5, Scene 6. But he's going to just round out the play for us. So in order to get there, Arden has been killed. He was stabbed by multiple people. Alice is the one that actually delivered the final death blow to him. And they were all immediately arrested because Michael Bolton doesn't know how to hide evidence. So Michael, Susan, Mosby, Alice, and even Bradshaw was even arrested for the murder of Arden. So they've been taken off and they're having their day in court. And Alice feels guilty about the whole thing and hopes that the afterlife she's able to make amends with Arden or whatever. She feels guilty about the whole thing. The rest of them are sort of like meh, or at least Mosby's sort of like meh, this is the thing that happened. Will and Shakebag, who participated in the actual murder, also both scattered. Shakebag went to seek asylum with somebody that he knew who refused him entrance, so he killed her and her husband and dumped their bodies in the Thames. Will decides that he just needs to get on a boat and get out of town. So that's what he has gone to do. So that was Act 5, Scene 4 that we were in yesterday. Act 5, Scene 5 is we're back in the court, essentially, and by which I mean like a judicial court, not like the king's court. And it's sentencing time for those that are accused of the murder. And the Bradshaw is like, but I didn't even know what the contents of that letter was that I brought to Alice. Like, how can I be complicit in this plot when I didn't even know about it? And Alice is like, I'm so sorry, but yeah, that's probably why they're gonna get you. And Susan turns to Mosby. She's like, I didn't know anything about this, like, until after it happened. Like, I helped clean it up, but I didn't know about any sort of plot. How am I supposed to die for this? And Mosby's like, well, there's nothing really that I can do about that now. And the mayor comes down with the proclamation that all 5 of them have to die. He sends Mosby and Susan off to one place to be killed. He sends Alice off somewhere else to be burned at the stake. And he sends Michael and Bradshaw yet somewhere else to be killed through an undisclosed method. And that's the end of Act 5, Scene 5. So then for the epilogue / Act 5, Scene 6, Franklin comes out and says, "Thus have you seen the truth of Arden's death. As for the ruffians, Shakebag and Black Will, the one took sanctuary and, being sent for out, was murdered in Southwark as he passed to Greenwich where the Lord Proctor lay. Black Will was burned in Flushing on a stage. Green was hanged in Osbridge at Kent. The painter fled, and how he died we know not, but this above the rest is to be noted. Arden lay murdered in that plot of ground, which he by force and violence held from Reed. And in the grass his body's print was seen 2 years and more after the deed was done. Gentlemen, we hope you'll pardon this naked tragedy, wherein no filed points are foisted in to make it gracious to the ear or eye, for simple truth is gracious enough, and needs no other points of glossing stuff." And that's the end of the play. So he's giving us a quick recap of how everybody died. He fills us in that Shakebag and Black Will were both killed in their attempts to escape, and Green was also hanged in Kent. The painter, which is an interesting point, remember there was the painter who could paint things that would make people die, and he had given this crucifix to Alice that would supposedly, whoever looked at it would die. That whole thing never went anywhere. We don't know what happened to that crucifix. Does somebody still have it? We don't think anybody actually used it in the course of the play. But anyway, that painter ran away and died somehow. But then he's like, the spot where Arden's body was, you could see it for 2 years afterwards, more than 2 years afterwards. You could see that that's where Arden's body was taken out and dumped. And then he's like, this wasn't fancy, this wasn't exaggerated, this was just the simple truth, but sort of a horrific enough truth to not need any sort of embellishment. And that's the end of the play. So maybe a little unsatisfying in that respect, that he doesn't really put a button on it. He's just sort of like, and that's that. Shoot. Everybody's dead and we told the truth. And go home now from seeing the play. Like, he doesn't ask for for forgiveness from the audience if the play was dull or anything like that we've seen in other Shakespearean epilogues. He's just like, that was that. The interesting part about him saying, that's the truth and that's enough, there was actually a man named Arden who lived in Faversham and was killed, and his body was taken out and dumped. This happened in like 1551 or some such thing. And it's entirely possible that this play was based on actual events, probably with some dramatic embellishment thrown in, because of course you have to. You don't necessarily know what all of the plots were that led up to his death. But theoretically, this could have been based on actual events. So like a crime drama from the late 1500s, early 1600s. And isn't that fun? So yeah, that's Arden of Faversham. It's I think a bit of a unique play, and as multiple scholars have gone through it and they've done word comparisons and phrase comparisons to try to figure out who exactly wrote this, because we're not entirely sure. Some people say it was Thomas Kyd. Some people say, well, the middle section was definitely Shakespeare. Some people say, no, it obviously wasn't. There's been so much speculation about who actually wrote this play, and I have to say, from my very uneducated perspective, just reading through it, it doesn't quite feel like a Shakespeare play to me. In part because it's a crime drama, which he hadn't done otherwise, but maybe that could just be that it's a standalone thing. There are certain elements to it. It has a bit of a farcical nature, which could go in with some of Shakespeare's other comedies, like Will trying to kill Arden but getting bonked in the head and being unable to do it, or them getting lost in the fog and not being able to commit the murder. So there are those kind of silly moments that are maybe even reminiscent of the stockings in Twelfth Night, the gartered stockings in Twelfth Night. And it's also not totally unprecedented in the Shakespearean canon to have a play that starts out as a comedy but ends up as a tragedy, like Romeo and Juliet. The first half of Romeo and Juliet is basically a comedy and the second half is a tragedy. And we see something similar here with all this crazy farcical stuff going on as they try to plot and kill Arden, but then once they actually kill him and they get arrested and they all get sentenced to death, and Franklin's just sort of like, well, and that's how it happened, boom. There is that sort of tie-in, but just in reading it and in who the play is actually about, Shakespeare didn't write much. He wrote the made-up plays, the made-up comedies, the As You Like It and Much Ado About Nothing and all that sort of stuff about people who were still sort of noble birth. He didn't write a lot about the commoners. And Arden, it could be argued, is maybe sort of a noble because he got all of these lands of the Abbey of Faversham. But that didn't necessarily make him a lord or put him in line for the throne. This wasn't a battle about getting back a crown or birthrights or anything like that. We had Reed and Green who were upset that their lands were taken away, but that's not the central plot of the story, and that's not why Arden's wife and Mosby wanted Arden to die. That's not the central tenet of this play, or at least it doesn't feel like the central tenet of this play to me. So it's interesting that this play is about more common people, which then if we want to look at Sir Thomas More, which again, Shakespearean, perhaps Apocrypha, dealt a little bit more with the commoners, but was still essentially about Thomas More. So in subject matter, I think it's a little bit different. But even in Sir Thomas More, when we're with the commoners and seeing things from their perspective, the language was still fairly flowery and poetic and beautiful and fun to say, whereas a lot of the language in Arden of Faversham, to me, feels much more straightforward. And I don't think that that's just because I've been studying this stuff for the last 4.5 years. It feels less complicated to figure out what's actually happening and who's saying what to whom. It's not as much like speaking an entirely different language as some other Elizabethan plays are, which is why I wonder, when I finished reading it, I was like, so which part was Shakespeare supposed to have written, because it just doesn't feel to me like the same language throughout. There are those that have done the studies and they say that, you know, scenes 4 through 9 could have been Shakespeare's contribution to it, and I would need to look at those scenes again from a language perspective to see if I agree with that. I am not the expert on this, so my opinion doesn't really count. But yeah, to me, it doesn't really feel like a Shakespearean play. But I do like the fact that we got to dig into a different Elizabethan play and see what that's like, just to see what the competition was around that time. Because we know a lot of stuff had to be written during that time period, you know, literature, theater, art, poetry. These were vibrant things in the Elizabethan era. There was a lot of it going on, and it's just interesting to see from a comparison standpoint maybe why Shakespeare's plays have held up over the last 400 years, whereas maybe some of the others have fallen into a bit more obscurity. So anyway, those are my thoughts. Those are my real quick thoughts on Arden of Faversham. I would love to know what you thought of the play. Did you have any favorite moments? Was there stuff that was unclear? If you have comments or questions, please leave them down below and I'll do my best to respond to them. But tomorrow we get to start in on New Play Day. And as I mentioned, we're going to start in with the Spanish tragedy, because we've got the Spanish tragedy and the Yorkshire tragedy, and then we'll finish off the Apocrypha with the comedy being Double Falsehood. So I will see you tomorrow when we start in on a Spanish tragedy. I'll see you then. Mwah.